Hi, and welcome. I am Professor Javier Gonzalez-Meeks. Thank you for attending this lecture for Latin Heritage Month. What we're looking at is cannibals, savages, and heathens. This presentation is gonna look to demystify culture and society of the Aztecs. I do wanna say a special thanks for the IDEA Committee, as well as our Equity Office, as well as the Office of Professional Development for helping co-sponsor this event, as well as our own History Department at Miramar College. So here we go. Templo Mayor, Mexico City. This is where we're going to start our scene. On the right, as you'll see, I'm sorry, I was reading something. Templo Mayor. What is left of it is available or survives right here in the middle of Mexico City, in what is now the Zocalo. To the left is a reconstruction of Templo Mayor. It was destroyed about 500 years ago, and just recently in August 13th, there was a celebration in Mexico City, celebrating or remembering, depending on how you want to look at it, the fall of Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Mexica. And it was quite a beautiful event. I was following it on Twitter. I was looking at it on my phone. It was an all-day event. It started in the morning, huge crowds of people. A lot of them were masked, which made me happy. And so it was a very joyous celebration that we see going on. What was really cool on the Templo Mayor was a projection of the history of the Mexica on the actual temple itself, on the Templo Mayor. Right here, we have an image of Cuauhtemoc, the last of the Mexica Aztec leaders. And the story that projected, it was with music. It wasn't speaking, it was all with music. And it started with the Mexica wandering through the valley of Mexico. They make their way, interact. They see the eagle landing on the cactus, eating a snake. So it does the whole history of the Mexica, the rise to eventual encounter with the Spaniards that we'll talk about later in this presentation, and the eventual fall of Tenochtitlan itself. But like I was saying, the whole event was quite beautiful. It was, you had performers, dancers, dressing in beautiful feathers, even the lighting outside. Right here, we have an image of Quetzalcoatl, one of the feathered serpent, one of the major deities for the Mexica. And it was just quite awesome to see this in the Zocalo, people celebrating, doing, ancient Mexica rituals. So it was very nice to see. But not everything was so happy though. We are gonna watch a quick video clip, and it's gonna look at, the tradition of the indigenous people in Mexico City itself, or just in Mexico itself, and their struggle, because their struggle is also real there. And we'll talk more about that throughout this presentation. 1 second. Basically what the video was showing was the history of the fall of Tenochtitlan. It was showing how the indigenous people have also been dealing with a lot of discrimination for over 700 years, even though this is a 500-year celebration. So it's talking about even though there's a celebration about indigenous history, there is really no respect for the indigenous population in Mexico itself. And so this kind of starts with our discussion, right, about who the Mexica are, who are the Aztecs. And I don't want to keep going back and forth. The name Mexica is the actual name for the Aztecs. The Aztecs are not, that is the name given to them later. It's associated from their homeland, their mythical homeland of Aztlan, but they're called Mexica. And in the video, the mayor of Mexico City was saying that is the name for Mexico. Mexico itself is a Nahuatl name. It's an indigenous name, meaning land of the Mexica. So when you look at Mexica up on the top, you take out the A, you add an O, land of the Mexica. You put the O in there, Mexico, or Mexica, and then take the O out, put the A, land of the Mexica. So let's start looking at these images, right? The images that we probably think of the Mexica Aztecs. Here on the left, we have from the United States, part of a Latinx Heritage Month, Aztec celebration. And you have dancers, right? They're smiling. It's a family. They're having a good time. And then on the right, looks like someone. If that was an Uber driver, I would not get in the car. Someone scary, right? Very bloodthirsty, very violent. This was from a TV show, Mankind, the history of all of us, produced by the History Channel. And why we're looking at that, why we're looking at the images of savagery, because it's something that's been embedded within our culture. Even going to Mel Gibson's Apocalypto movie. Now, granted, it was supposedly based on the Maya, but he just used all the different customs of Mesoamerican culture and just used all the nasty bits of it, especially human sacrifice, how the audience was just like an orgy of fun just to watch that. And we'll talk more about Aztec and ritual sacrifice in a little bit, but these are the depictions, sacrifice, ripping the heart out, very Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, like Mola Ram ripping hearts out. That is the image that we associate a lot with the Mexica. And even when you go online, you have Mr. Danny right here. What do they eat, right? Not just corn, not just chocolate, but also they ate human flesh as well. So, it's all these nasty bits that we think about or we hear about. It keeps getting embedded in our head of the Mexica. Even we have this YouTube video right here, Aztec sacrifice, right? Nothing about the culture, nothing about engineering, but sacrifice, everything about sacrifice and violence. Why is that important? It's because of what we're going to see next on Twitter, social media that gets regurgitated, gets spread out, these ideas. Here are the top tweet by Harold Shamrock. The Mexicans weren't very bright, though. They thought those bearded white dudes were gods. Not true. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Then you have this pseudo-author, Mark Noonan. Good. If there were ever people that needed to be conquered, it was the bloodthirsty, savage Aztecs. So again, we have this negative image of the Mexica. And even across the Atlantic, the leader of the Socialist Party in Aragon is trying to separate itself from Spain. And he's celebrating colonialism. He's celebrating like, yeah, we went out there, we conquered them, and we brought them civilization and a whole bunch of other things too. But we're not going to talk about that. So again, the ideas of bringing civilization, that the Mexica are uncivilized, barbaric, heathen, bloodthirsty, and we get that also in our news. The president from the last presidency talking about how Mexico only doesn't send its best, right? They only bring drug dealers and rapists. And here we have a picture of a poor mother, trying to bring the best for her children, getting tear gassed. Or the other families that are caged like animals right now, separated from their families. All of that we see, but all that part of that rhetoric of barbarians, of cannibals, of just murderous, bloodthirsty heathens. Now, where did this all come from? Where did this ideas of all this come from? It didn't just start with Trump. It didn't start with on Twitter, but it started with this knucklehead. It started with Columbus, right around 1492. And we see this time period between the 15th, 16th century, the 14th to the 1600s, when Europeans start to colonize, they start to expand out, looking for the trade routes to Asia, looking for commodities. And what we have is depictions of Native Americans, all Native Americans from North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean islands as depicted as barbarians, savages, heathens. All this as a way to rationalize colonialism, violence, forced labor, slavery. All that to rationalize the sad history between the European colonization in the Americas. Even Columbus created the term cannibal himself. So what we see is in this PowerPoint, Columbus was writing to the king and queen of Spain, the Spanish crown, telling them about this other group called Caribe. And the Caribe were these islanders that'll come out and they'll hunt the Taino and they'll eat them and all this stuff. And so he wrote this to the king and queen. Queen Isabella wrote an edict saying, hey, if you find anyone that's doing this nasty stuff of cannibalism, of eating people, you capture them, you enslave them. That is your duty. And Columbus like, you got it. I'm going to do that. I see cannibals everywhere now. So that's what we have going on. That was the domino effect that we're going to see that's going to happen next when we look at Hernan Cortez. And what's quite fascinating about these accusations of cannibalism is Europeans were doing it too. And I'm not just talking about Catholic Church Mass. In the Catholic Church, when the priest blesses the host and the wine, that becomes the literal blood and body of Christ. You're actually you're eating Jesus Christ every Sunday when you go to church in the Catholic Church. But that's not talked about. Or even this right here, the use of ground up skulls or eating body fat or drinking blood as a way to provide virility, as a way to cure different ailments. And one of the more popular ones was mumia. What Europeans would do is they will get mummies. They'll go into Egypt, get mummies, and they'll grind up the mummies' bodies, and they'll mix it into like a potion, basically a drink, and that was supposed to cure ailments. This image right here, we have a poor Egyptian salesperson, trying to sell mummies to European tourists. And what happens if you can't afford the best thing of mummies? So a lot of grave robbers in Europe would go to the graves and take out bodies, skulls, and just use that instead. So Europeans were also practicing cannibalism too. But what we see when in the Americas, it becomes a justification for enslavement and a justification for colonizing. And that's exactly what happens when Columbus interacts with the Taino people. When Columbus asks, or not asks, the Taino to mine gold for him, to work labor for him, and they say no, and they revolt against him, he gets upset. He's like, oh, how dare you, bunch of cannibals. So it becomes a justification for enslavement, for violence on those that do not agree with Columbus. And essentially that will set the precedent for future colonial endeavors and expeditions, not just by the Spanish, but other European groups as well, pushing away those bloodthirsty savages. So after the Spanish start to colonize the Caribbean islands, when they start to enslave a lot of these cannibals, and cannibals gets changed into Caribe, and Caribe eventually turned into Caribbean. That's where we get the Caribbean islands from. It's the islands of the cannibals, basically. And eventually, we'll have one gentleman, Hernan Cortez, who will start making an expedition to the mainland of Mexico. And he's hearing things of this big civilization. Now, Spanish already run into Maya. There's still Maya around. It's not the big territorial states from the 300s. There's smaller villages, but they're starting to look for these complex societies, because that's what the Spanish are looking for. They look at the Taino are not wearing clothes or are naked. For Europeans, clothing reflects status. So you have no clothes, you have no status. When in Columbus's letters, he talks about the lack of monumental structures. But when Cortez starts to look and see, like, wow, there's Maya temples, and then there's Mexica and different other groups temples, like, hey, there's a civilization out here that knows how to build, that knows how to construct, that has a level of social stratification where they can get people to work and build stuff for us, or me, as Cortez was look at it. So let's get to our myths and our interactions between the Mexica and the Spanish. The first one, the first myth, Spaniards were considered gods. Not true, not true at all. In all the Spanish sources, all the contemporary Spanish sources, even Cortez does not refer to himself as a god, or that the Mexica thought that they were gods at all. That would be invented about 2 decades later by a lot of the grandchildren of the Mexica noblemen, as they're being forced to write their histories under the pen of Franciscan friars, as a way to justify, wow, what happened to our grandpa? Now, why did we lose? Oh, it had to, they must have thought that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. And that is something that was not written by Cortez. It was not written by any of the firsthand accounts of the Spanish. And it's wrong, because it shows the Mexica as gullible, superstitious. And we'll talk about them later, but also shows the weak-mindedness, so to speak, of Moctezuma. So that's one myth you have to get rid of, as we saw in that one tweet. No, the Mexica did not see them as gods. They saw them as humans, another group of humans that were, had interesting technology. Their canoes were bigger. They used bigger cloth to catch the wind. They rode these funny animals, and they definitely smelled. So they were a different group. And how do you get this group to work with you? Do you bring them into your empire? Or do you kind of just push them away, kind of give them some tribute and say, hey, just go away, you smell too bad? And that is what's going to be on the mind of Moctezuma. We're going to look at that in a little bit. The other one is the Spaniards defeated the Aztecs because of military superiority. The Jared Diamond wrote his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. That was the only thing that defeated the Mexica. No, it was not the only thing. It was very complicated. It was a very complicated affair, because you have a lot of alliances, a lot of the indigenous people that we'll talk about in a little bit, that allied themselves with the Spanish. Now let's talk about the guns. The Spanish guns sucked. They're not good. And these are not like, modern day guns. It's not where you play on Halo and you keep reloading. No. These were old muskets where you had to make sure your gunpowder was dry. The Caribbean and this area in the Valley of Mexico, very wet. So very hard to keep your gunpowder dry. Also, too, you had to drop your ball into the musket, pack it in, then you had to get your fuse, and you had to light it, all while looking at Mr. Mexica like, hey, please don't charge on me. I'm gonna shoot you right now. That's not gonna happen. It's like, oh yeah, sure, I'll stop and let you shoot me. No, it's not gonna happen. So there was actually an account by a Spanish conquistador that actually wrote a book on guerrilla warfare against indigenous people in the Americas. And he essentially wrote no, the best thing you do with your gun, your rifle, is to turn it around and use it as a club. That is the only use you're going to have with your gun. It's not going to be shooting them all up. You have the steel, but the Mexica are already on you. The indigenous allies are already on you already. They have obsidian club swords, some that are so strong they can decapitate a horse. So, the superiority, again, it's a myth. It's to justify why the Spanish were able to defeat the Aztecs. Because when Cortez goes back to this crown, he has to justify to them why they deposed a empire. That wasn't his job. Cortez wasn't meant to go to Mexico. The governor of Cuba told Cortez, you stay here. Cortez violated a military order and wrote to King Charles V and said, hey, King Charles, the governor says no, but I'm going to go and conquer. I'm going to go find out what's going on for you. King Charles received the letter. He ignored it. He ignored it because there was a German monk that was threatening to break up the Catholic Church. That was Martin Luther. So King Charles V had bigger things to worry about than small little conquistador that had dreams of gaining gold, glory, and God. So what we have is, Cortez violating direct orders that he'll have to address. So he comes up with all these lies and these myths. Oh, they thought we were way superior. And we'll talk about Moctezuma in a little bit. But another big thing that to recall too is the allies. There was in the Valley of Mexico, all these city-states, they were all interconnected through marriage, but they were all looking to topple the next person off. Now, when we looked at the Spanish, it wasn't aligned with the Spanish to help them out. It was to help them out, but it wasn't like they were go Spain. It wasn't like, yeah, go Messi kind of Spain. No. They saw an opportunity to topple off the Mexica so they can put one of their nephews or sons as the next Tlatoani, the next ruler. Moctezuma. The myth, Moctezuma was weak. He was incompetent. He thought Cortez was a god. He couldn't tell. That's all false. Not true. Moctezuma himself, as a leader, he was picked over his cousins. His uncle was the emperor. It was a council of elders that looked at all the sons. It was not a I'm forgetting the word right now. It wasn't a society that just went on the firstborn son of the king. The kings had many sons, but it was the best one, and the best one that was able to rule and lead. And the Mexica elders selected Moctezuma over the emperor's sons, his own sons, and picked his nephew as the next ruler. Moctezuma will go out after his coronation and lead a war against some vassal city-states in Oaxaca area. He would win and bring tribute back. So he's expanding the empire. He's bringing wealth into the empire. And his interaction with Cortez is very interesting, because what we have is when Cortez comes to Moctezuma, Moctezuma's trying to figure him out. Because it's not just Cortez, it's Cortez and like the Tlaxcalans, the Depictions, all these other enemies of the Mexica. So Moctezuma has to be very diplomatic about this. He has to be very diplomatic about this situation. So what he does as a way to observe Cortez is he puts him in one of the houses that his uncle used to live in that was right in the by the zoo. In Tenochtitlan, we'll talk about Tenochtitlan a little bit. They had a large zoo, not as big as our own San Diego zoo, but they had a large zoo. But that's where he put them. He housed the Spaniards as guests in the zoo as a way to observe, as a way to watch, as a way to look and interact. So that is not what you do with a god, right? You don't put them in the zoo. So Moctezuma is trying to figure out who the Spanish are. He tries to bribe them. He tries to give them some tribute. Hey, just go away. He gives them, it's like what he considers, and what the Mexica and everyone else in the Valley of Mexico is basically the poop of the gods. And that is gold. The Mexica and the rest of the Nahuas peoples don't value gold. Their major form of currency is chocolate. Chocolate is their major form of currency, cocoa beans. So for Moctezuma, he's like, well, I'll just give you some of the gold, right? This is what Huitzilopochtli ate and digested. Here you go away. For Cortez, he sees it differently. So we have two different cultures looking at an event differently. Moctezuma trying his best to try to figure out what to do with these individuals. And even though all the Spanish sources try to downplay Moctezuma, they are also describe him, as very smart, very astute. And there's conflicting accounts of what happens to Moctezuma. He does get kidnapped by Cortez. Some sources of the Spanish say that his own people killed him. Indigenous sources say the Spaniards killed him and threw him into the river. So, conflicting accounts of what happened. Cortez kidnaps Moctezuma, holds him for ransom, and what we see is the end of that diplomacy. And probably the big one, right? The Aztecs love their human sacrifices, right? They heart human sacrifice. Now this one is tough because they did conduct human sacrifice. We have to look within the historical context. It's not to say that we either approve or disapprove of it. We have to understand what the function held within their society. For the Mexica, they are doing customs that every other group within the Valley of Mexico are doing. When they migrated down around the 1100s into the Valley of Mexico, they started to observe and adopt a lot of the practices of different groups in their region, the Valley of Mexico. And a lot of them was human sacrifice. But it was very ritualistic because within the religious pantheon of the Mexica, their gods gave their life for humanity, for the Mexica. All right, so here we are with the human sacrifices, right? So we're talking about ritual sacrifice. This was something that was borrowed around the Lake Texcoco, around the Valley of Mexico. It was a way to remember what the Mexica gods gave to them, life. So it was very ritualistic. It wasn't something that occurred every day. It wasn't, chopping up hearts up every day. It was a ritual calendar that happened. It happened occasionally. Eventually, when the Mexica right around the 1300s, and they become a big powerhouse and empire, till the beginning parts of their interactions with the Spaniards, the intensification of sacrifice, more as a way of intimidation. What the Mexica would do is they'll go to different city-states and welcome the leaders there. I'm like, hey, come hang out with us for a little bit. We want to show you something. We want you to join our empire. So you have these leaders go, and then the Mexica would conduct these very flamboyant sacrifices as a way of propaganda, as a way to intimidate the city-states to join them, right? Join the empire or die, basically. So it's a form of intimidation that we see. And there was other forms of sacrifice. It wasn't just, ripping the hearts out. I mean, think about it. That is something the Spaniards saw, and that was something to intimidate the Spaniards. How do you get these people they're not familiar with, either they're going to join you or not join you? Well, let's scare them a bit, right? And that probably freaked them out. But other forms of sacrifices that occurred as well. It could be from personal sacrifice, like fasting, something I can barely do, and go 3 hours without eating. There's also bloodletting. You get a needle of a cactus, you prick your finger. For the man, you do a little prick on your penis to let the blood flow for fertility. So different ways of bloodletting that we have. There's also animal sacrifice as well. It wasn't just all human, as well as libation. Libation is those little, when you go to a party and pour one out for your homies, that's a form of libation. You're pouring one out literally for those that know, whether it's like it'll be like chocolate drink, basically. So pouring out either early form of tequila or hot cocoa. So the sacrifices serve different functions, but sadly, this has become the only trope we usually think about with the Aztecs. And it's important to remember, understand the context to it, what it was used for as well, because human sacrifice has been something used with all human civilizations throughout the world as well. But this is something that gets just embedded in our human thought and imagination. Can we go to the next slide, please? The last one of our last myths is the Spanish conquest of Mexico was complete in 1521. After Cuauhtemoc, the last ruler, was killed, August 13th, 1521, that was it, right? No, that's not what happened. It's very similar to, like, Luke Skywalker destroying the Death Star. He didn't destroy the Empire. He destroyed, a battle station. The Empire was still there. And so the capital of Tenochtitlan was destroyed, yes, but there were other Mexica cities around Lake Texcoco that even the Spanish were had to use, a lot of the Nahuatl-speaking nobles to help control. So this went from one hand to another. There was still 80,000 miles of territory to control. There wasn't enough Spaniards to control all that. So it went from one hand to another. It went to another Nahuatl family, another leader. So yeah, we see the capital of Tenochtitlan destroyed, yes. But a lot of the indigenous people around, they were still around. And they also resisted against the Spanish. They did what they wanted to do, and that was to topple the Mexica. Now they didn't need the Spanish anymore. And the conflict that will ensue between those indigenous groups and the Spanish, we'll see that even till today, as indigenous groups still continue to fight for rights with their Mexican government. Next slide, please. Also, too, there's over 68 major indigenous groups living in Mexico today. Nahuatl is still a spoken language. It's not a dead language. So it's still spoken, different dialects, and there's still cultural practices today. The Spanish didn't eradicate or kill every single indigenous group. What they did was they tried to, synchronize. They tried to, blend a lot of their culture beliefs with the indigenous beliefs. And that happens a lot when you see the next slide. Give me the next slide, please. With the Mictlantecuhtli, or the god of death, to the Catholic saint Santa Muerte. So a lot of the gods get, transformed into different Aztec, different Catholic saints. One of the bigger ones is the Virgen de Guadalupe. A lot of the imagery reflects the imagery of the Mexica gods. A lot of the Mexica gods, they're carried by lesser beings. The Virgen de Guadalupe is just carried by an angel. The angel has eagle feathers. Doesn't even have the white angelic feathers that you see within the Abrahamic religions. And so, and then the images of the sun and the moon and the stars all represent Tonatzin Colicue, the mother goddess. So there's still religious practices still done today that still reflect the indigenous practices of over 700 years ago. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So now we took away a lot of the myths. Who were these Mexica Aztecs? Who were they if we don't just look at just the blood sacrifice? They were master engineers. The middle picture on top is of an aqueduct, Chapultepec. They loved music. They loved to dance. They're great farmers. The little chinampas floating land beds right there. Great artists, right? They love to cook. They dance. All these things. They had a calendar system. So very advanced civilization that the Spanish encountered. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
It's taking a minute to load.
Oh. There we go. All right, so the rise of the Mexica. Now we said earlier the Mexica came from the north. They traveled down the valley of Mexico to Lake Texcoco. The word Aztec comes from the mythical land of where they're from, Aztlan. Eventually, right around the 1300s, their power, their growing in power becomes, starts to conflict with a lot of the power base in the Valley of Mexico. So what they're kicked out, they're punished, they're sent to Tenochtitlan. It's a small island. Now the water itself in Lake Texcoco is 7 feet. So it's not that deep, but still they're kicked out into this um, cactus snake infested island. Now for the groups that kicked out the Mexica, like, yeah, that's their deathbed. They're gonna die there. For the Mexica, like, all right, we get a little tacos with snake and nopales, it'll be fine. They made the best of the situation. That is where the priest saw the eagle on a cactus eating a snake, and that is when all their journeys, all their wandering around the desert will come to an end, and that is where they're going to build their island city of Tenochtitlan using Chinampa engineering, using other forms of engineering to create artificial land. Next slide, please. My wife is also looking after her kid. All right, so engineering. So the Chinampas themselves is a form of agriculture. It's a way of creating these artificial land beds. And what you do is kind of like lasagna. You kind of layer earth with reeds, earth and reed, and then you're able to plant and create these artificial lands. And if you look at Tenochtitlan, the map on the top, you can see these little avenues. A lot of those green areas are the Chinampas, agricultural farmland. And what they're growing is corn, bean, and squash. Major food commodities for not just the Mexica, for a lot of indigenous groups in North and South America. Now, why it's so important is quite interesting. The corn itself, it sucks out all the nitrogen out of the soil. The squash actually puts nitrogen back into the soil. So you have the corn and the squash working together. And then the beans, the long bean shoots, they have these little prickly vines. That's to protect the corn stalk from other kind of rodents. So you have the three sisters, they're called, corn, bean, and squash. And that's going to provide enough sustenance to provide for a growing population. And that's what we see what happens in Tenochtitlan. The engineering, the farm agricultural techniques is going to allow for the growth in population. Now you don't just have little farmers, but now you have little warriors, and now you could train them. Now you have a complex social structure that develops in Tenochtitlan. They create an aqueduct, something that only few civilizations like the Roman Empire has done. And it's a water system that brings fresh water. And there's two alleys of Chapultepec, one that brings in the fresh water and one that is clean. So there's constantly fresh water coming in because the water in Lake Texcoco is brackish. So it's a mix of both fresh water and salt water. You can't drink it. So eventually they'll figure out a way to create these dikes in the southern part of Lake Texcoco to separate out the brackish water, to separate the salt and fresh water. And something else too is there's no water that can escape out of Lake Texcoco. So, and I said about 7 feet tall in depth. So when there's a hard rain, the city will flood. And there was a big flood in the 1400s that almost devastated Tenochtitlan. So the engineers went back and created a system to release water in certain areas in Lake Texcoco to kind of regulate the water depth in Lake Texcoco. So you have these master engineers to control the water around it, to bring fresh water in, as well as to create these artificial land, not just by the Chinampas, but by piling in these logs, tightly packed, and putting volcanic rock on top as a foundation system. And in the middle of that foundation system will be Templo Mayor, their major religious temple. Here we have, I'm not going to get a chance to read the description of Tenochtitlan, but from Hernan Cortez, when he writes about Tenochtitlan, he talks about how beautiful it is, how it rivals cities in Europe. And here we have in this image right here on the top of Templo Mayor, the twin pyramids, right, of Tlaloc, the god of rain, and Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. So, they got everything situated. They got war and rain. So they got it situated. They got weather and fighting for tribute, because you need to get those cocoa beans in. You need the chocolate. Next slide, please. And some of the cultural achievements of the Mexica, numerical systems. I mean, you can't really do engineering without math. Math is vital. And so they created a number system to help them, with the engineering, to help them also with tribute. How else can you take account of all the tribute that's coming into Tenochtitlan? Tenochtitlan was a major marketplace with different goods coming from different areas of Mexico, as far north as we'll have like Arizona, to as far south as to present-day Panama. So you have all these different commodities coming in to Tenochtitlan, and a calendar system, a secular and a religious calendar system to help them understand, well, when it's going to rain, and also when to do certain religious festivals. I mean, look at our calendar system today. It's kind of a blend of both secular and religious. Not everyone is Christian, but on my Google phone, it's still going to have Christmas and Easter on it. So, it's a blending of both. And it'll still have like St. Patty's Day and other holidays on there as well that are popular within the United States. 4th of July is on there. So different holidays. So you have a secular and religious calendar. Our next achievement is medicine and the understanding of different herbs to help out with the injured, painkillers, especially for women for childbirth, muscle relaxers for the soldiers, disinfectants to heal wounds. They performed surgery. They used obsidian glass rock that even today is sharper than what surgical knives are used today. And they needed these to help with the surgeries, to help out with fractures, traction and counter fracture. They were able to help out manipulate the bone back into place. And how the person kind of get through the pain, even arthritis and stuff like that. So all these different uses of different plants, ethnogenic plants. It's a form of it's hallucinogenic plants, right? As well. So you have all the knowledge of the medicine and the herbs and around them. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. I'm sorry for the little tech issue that we had. If you're curious and you're more interested in more reading, or if you don't have time to read because you have crazy children running around, you can listen to a podcast. There's the NPR Throughline, Tenochtitlan, a retelling of the conquest. History Hack is a very interesting podcast, and there's one called Aztecs, and that's with the scholar Matthew Restall. And if you're interested in the new book by Camilla Townsend, The Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, where she looks at indigenous sources to retell or change a little bit of the story of the Mexica Aztecs. You can read her book, or you can listen to her summary of her book on New Books Network, Fifth Son. Well, thank you everyone for showing up and attending. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I will hold them for the next 5 minutes.